Good evening. I'm here to talk about Alexander Zemlinsky, a name probably most of you are not familiar with, unless you're a member of my family, any number of whom could probably give this talk by now. They've lived with him for so long. But I'll do it. I thought before talking specifically about Zemlinsky and his relationship to Brahms, it was necessary a little bit if you understood a little bit more about Zemlinsky's life. And I thought it might be most enlightening to kind of start from the end. He was best known probably during his lifetime as a conductor. He conducted at a number of major houses in Europe, Vienna, Prague, and Berlin last. He was respected among his colleagues, conducting colleagues, and really considered one of the conducting elite of the day. He continued to compose during his lifetime. He never had planned on becoming a conductor. It was something that basically circumstances dictated. At one point early in his life, he needed to earn a steady, if modest, income. So he turned to conducting. But he continued to compose rather prodigiously when he could find the time. So he abandoned the life of a freelance composer that he had led, somewhat of a life of leisure, up to the turn of the century, the year 1900. And literally in that year, his father died, and he became kind of the head of the household. So he used his summers basically for composing, and the off-season, vacation times, things like that. And he actually amassed a rather significant amount of work. 7 operas, chamber music, choral music, symphonic works with and without voice, works early on for solo piano, and a number of other chamber works, including the sonata that you're going to hear tonight. And he was also a first-rate pianist on top of all that. He actually entered the conservatory as a pianist and turned more to composition and then eventually to composing. So he was the whole package. He was really one of the few one of the last remaining Viennese composers who really did it all. And it makes the fact that he died forgotten, I think, that much more tragic. He didn't promote himself. He felt that both his music should do its own talking, and that the people whose music he promoted should, in fact, turn around and do the same for him, and very few people did. So perhaps he could be blamed for not pushing his own image stronger, but it just was not his personality. He also didn't produce radical music during a day when progressive musical thought seemed to be a demand. He was both very good friends and ultimately the brother-in-law of Arnold Schoenberg, but he never went nearly as far as Arnold Schoenberg did in creating a new musical language. He also promoted Schoenberg's music from the podium, but he felt there was a limit to how far he could go actually with his own music. Likewise with composers like Stravinsky and Bartók being the best known. These are all major players who created radical new musical ideas, and Zemlinsky was very much rooted in the classical tradition in which he was trained in Vienna. A lot of these kind of ideas since the time of Bach and Beethoven were drummed into his head, and he had a hard time relinquishing these ideas. So he ultimately became somewhat progressive in terms of the kinds of things he was doing, but never was able to let go of the traditions in which he was grounded. And finally, he converted to Protestantism. He was Jewish born. He converted to Protestantism in the early years of the 19th century, early years of the 20th century. But ultimately, when the Nazis came to power, the fact that he had Jewish blood, that betrayed him. And he ended up fleeing Germany, actually fleeing Austria with his wife, coming to New York, and dying in 1942, forgotten in large part. So all of these things really contributed to his downfall. And it was probably close to, he died in 1942, and it wasn't until the 1970s that anything about Zemlinsky started to happen. And then it took quite a while. wasn't played, his name really wasn't remembered, and he was one of a handful of composers who were kind of extinguished during the Nazi Reich, who have now started to get their due. There is an event that took place in 1933, which kind of sealed his fate, and I'll talk very briefly about that. His last opera, called The Chalk Circle, finally seemed to bring him the notoriety that he so long desired, and which he really deserved. It received in 1934 simultaneous performances across Germany, where he was living at the time, and he thought at this point finally he's going to make his big breakthrough, and the Reich then put a stop to that. The opera has issues of there's a lot of social commentary in there. There's basically a government that's very repressive. There are social issues that the Nazis didn't feel were appropriate to high art, and they basically shut the opera down at the 11th hour, just at the time where he seemed finally was going to make a breakthrough. And that probably did him in psychologically. He wasn't able to recover from that. Also musically, the conducting engagements stopped coming in. He had moved back to Vienna by this point, trying to restart his career. He had been working in a very well-known opera house in Berlin up to this point. The Nazis came in, shut the opera house down. He fled, went back to Vienna, and finally had to leave Vienna with the Anschluss. So by the time he came to the United States, not only was he unknown here, but it also begun to fade very much from musical life in Europe as well. The years leading up to the turn of the century, however, were years filled very much with promise. He was a rising star of Vienna. He scored numerous first prizes, second prizes in competitions, both in Vienna and elsewhere. His work and his talent was recognized by his peers and by well-known composers still in Vienna. And Brahms, probably most among them, really kind of eventually took Zemlinsky under his wing, to whatever extent Brahms was willing to take anybody under his wing. Zemlinsky joined an organization called the Tonkünstlerverein, which was an organization led by Brahms to promote new music, but very much music of a conservative fashion, very much in the Brahmsian role. Brahms was president of the society and basically dictated what took place there. And Zemlinsky joined both as a composer and a pianist, so he performed both his music and music of other composers as well. And by being a member of the society, also spoke his allegiance to the master. And Brahms at this point was nearing the end of his life, but he was already considered not only one of the great composers obviously ever associated with Vienna, but one of the greatest in the world. And the fact that he was now showing allegiance to Zemlinsky was a very flattering thing for the young man. Zemlinsky did not possess a large ego, which is one of the things that may have proved his undoing. And he was very much enamored with Brahms and Brahms' music. And he eventually began to incorporate Brahms' style, and you're going to hear some of that kind of peripherally in the sonata that I'm going to play for you tonight. But I thought that I would read from you, since reading is a part of the Church of Beethoven design, from my book on Zemlinsky, where Zemlinsky first really comes into personal contact with Brahms outside of the domain of the Tonkünstlerverein. I think Brahms was still very much an unapproachable figure at that time. And so I'm going to read to you a passage that describes Zemlinsky's actually coming to Brahms' apartment and working one-on-one with the master.